If you're trying to make a mass ratio, so if we have two parts and then they're in an assembly and we want to find out the ratio of the part to the assembly, that's kind of what we want to go ahead and find out. So I have a simple assembly here with a box and a rectangle. So here's our square, here's our rectangle. So I'll dive into the square first and show you what we set up. So simply we just did a regular sketch and extruded it. So if we look at our parameters, we have our length, and the length is same as the width and the extrusion. I also set up a user parameter called square mass. Then I set up a simple iLogic rule that basically calls parameter, and then that parameter that we named, the user parameter, equals iProperties.mass. So it finds the iProperties and the mass, and then it pulls out the square mass. So as far as that goes, if you want to know what that is, you go to File, iProperties, go to Physical, and this is the actual mass right here, that 0.95. So that's what it's pulling in, and then it's assigning it to this square mass. So if we actually change that dimension from 3 to, let's say, 2, it'll then update that to there. So if we go to 4, it'll then update it again. So then if we return, we did the exact same thing with the rectangle. Went into the parameters. Here's our length, our width, and our height. Those are all definable. So we did the rectangle mass, and then there we go. That's linked again through another iLogic rule that just says rectangle mass. So you have to set it first. You can always find your user parameters here. So then if you just double click on it, it'll actually drop it in. So that way when we come up and we insert them into the assembly and just constrain them or ground them, whatever we got, then we can go into our parameters, and there's a couple of more. So I set some user parameters for the assembly mass so that we can divide by it, because the main thing is we need to make a ratio from the mass of the part divided by our the assembly's mass. So again, we created a rule that just grabs the assembly and puts the units into the assembly mass, so we can have a unitless conversion. So what this is right here is unitless. So you can look at length, and that would be like, centimeters, mass would be in grams or pound mass. And then you go down to here, which is unitless, and you select that, and that's UL. So that basically just gives us a number that we can work with and divide by. Also, you'll see that we have two linked parameters. So down here on the link button, you just hit link, you go find it, and then it'll bring it in whichever one you want, which is similar to the derive command if you've ever used that. So once we have our parts linked in, we can create a square ratio and a rectangle ratio to hold that value. So now we have our square mass divided by our assembly mass, and that gives us a ratio. And then we have our rectangle, and then that gives us another ratio. So as far as that goes, we also set up a event trigger that basically says the rule is run before the save of the document. So if we save the document, it'll update and then go from there. I also created a form that'll drive everything. So here's our size, so we don't have to dive into the part and change the parameters. So if we go into our size, you can say parameter is, here's the part, that's the dimension or parameter that we want, equals this user parameter. You'll see here. So we set these user parameters, and it basically pulls it up into the top level so we can have a form. So you just basically right click, say add form. Now we have a form that we can derive the entire assembly and all the dimensions that we want from the top level without having to dive in. So we can basically tab through these real quick, and then it'll update. Now you'll notice that right here, the mass didn't update until we save it, because then when we save it, the rule is run, and then the mass updates. So now, when we come into here, it'll update the mass. So here's our ratio for the square. Now the reason that we can't get it into this part list, you probably could if you wanted to try, but this is the easier way if you're not really going the extra mile. We can go to here, go to user parameters, and then we find our ratio. Here it is, our square ratio. And then there's this add parameter button. Brings it in and gets to right there. So that way you can drag that around. So that's all these are, just text boxes that bring in that parameter. Same thing here. This is bringing in the mass from the actual assembly. So you can go to here, physical properties, mass, and that brings it in. Or we could basically find the user parameter of assembly mass, which is going to be, if we bring that in, the same thing. So that way, if we go back to the part, we say, all right, let's make this bigger. So 8 by 5 by 7 by 2. That still doesn't update. We have to save, then that updates. Go back to our assembly here, and there you go. So then there's our mass, there's our ratio, and now you can figure out what you need. Now these things are not connected, so that's one unfortunate downside of doing it that way. There might be a trickier way using more iLogic to get it to stick actually into the part list, but that's an easy way just to bring them in if you want a static table.